In the scorching summer of 1887, when the Arizona Territory was still a lawless expanse where justice came from the barrel of a gun, a single desperate plea from a woman's lips would shatter the soul of the most hardened cowboy in Tombstone. What happened that fateful evening behind the Silver Dollar Saloon would become the most whispered about incident in the entire Southwest, a story so shocking that even the most seasoned gunfighters would fall silent when it was told. This is not just another tale of cowboys and outlaws. This is the true account of how one woman's final words turned a man's world upside down, revealing a truth so horrifying that it would haunt an entire town for generations to come. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about courage, sacrifice, and the price of survival in the Wild West. The woman's name was Elizabeth Morrison. The cowboy who heard her plea was Jack "Iron Hand" Sullivan. And what transpired between them in those final moments would become legend, though not the kind any man would want attached to his name. The dust never seemed to settle in Tombstone, Arizona Territory, during the summer of 1887. It hung in the air like a curse, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that made men's throats burn and women's eyes water. Jack Sullivan had grown accustomed to the taste of it on his tongue, the way it crunched between his teeth when he ate, and how it settled into every crease of his weathered leather chaps. At 32 years old, Jack had spent the better part of his life riding the range, driving cattle from Texas to Colorado, and doing whatever work a man with a strong back and steady aim could find in the territories. Jack earned his nickname Iron Hand not from any particular cruelty, but from his reputation with a lasso and his unshakable grip on a bronco's reins. He was a man of average height but broad shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and pale blue eyes that seemed to see everything without revealing much in return. His brown hair was always dusty, his boots always worn, and his Colt .45 always clean. He lived by a simple code: work hard, keep your word, and mind your own business unless someone else's business threatened innocent folks. The Silver Dollar Saloon sat on the corner of 5th and Allen Streets, its swinging doors never still for long. It was neither the finest establishment in Tombstone nor the roughest, which made it perfect for a man like Jack who wanted a drink and a hot meal without too much excitement. The owner, a portly man named Hiram Kowalski, ran a clean place where cowboys, miners, and the occasional traveling businessman could drink their whiskey without worrying about getting shot over a card game gone wrong. On the evening of July 15th, Jack had just finished a week-long cattle drive for the Rockingham Ranch, delivering 200 head of Longhorn to the railroad depot in Benson. The pay was good, $40, and he had money in his pocket for the first time in months. He planned to enjoy a few drinks, a steak dinner, and maybe even spring for a bath at the Occidental Hotel before finding work on another drive. The sun was setting behind the Dragoon Mountains as Jack pushed through the saloon doors, his spurs jangling softly against the wooden floor. The familiar smell of tobacco smoke, whiskey, and sawdust greeted him, along with the low murmur of conversation and the occasional laugh. About 24 men occupied the tables and bar, most of them dusty cowboys like himself, though he recognized a few townspeople and shopkeepers among the crowd. Jack nodded to Hiram behind the bar and took a seat at a small table near the window where he could watch the street. The bartender, a thin man with graying temples named Marcus, brought him a bottle of whiskey and a glass without being asked. Jack had been coming to the Silver Dollar for 3 years, and the staff knew his habits. As he poured his first drink of the evening, Jack noticed a woman sitting alone at a corner table near the back of the saloon. This was unusual, not because women never entered saloons in Tombstone, but because this particular woman looked decidedly out of place. She wore a dark blue dress that appeared to be made of quality fabric, not the rough cotton or worn calico most frontier women favored. Her auburn hair was pinned up neatly despite the heat, and, even from across the room, Jack could see that her hands were clean and soft, not the work-roughened hands of a ranch wife or shopkeeper's daughter. The woman kept glancing toward the doors as if expecting someone, but, as the minutes passed, her fidgeting increased. She had ordered nothing to drink, which was another oddity. Marcus had approached her table twice, and both times she had shaken her head politely but firmly. Jack found himself watching her more closely than was probably proper, but something about her nervous energy set him on edge. About an hour after full darkness settled over the town, Jack heard raised voices from the street outside. Through the window, he could see 3 men on horseback arguing with someone on the boardwalk, though he couldn't make out their words over the noise inside the saloon. One of the mounted men was gesticulating angrily, while another kept looking back toward the livery stable at the end of the street. The woman at the corner table had gone rigid, her face pale as she stared at the window. Jack followed her gaze and saw that the three horsemen had dismounted and were now walking purposefully toward the silver dollar. Something cold settled in Jack's stomach. In his experience, when men rode into town after dark and made a beeline for the saloon with that kind of determination, trouble usually followed. The swinging doors burst open with enough force to slam against the walls, causing every conversation in the room to stop abruptly. The three men who entered were clearly not local cowboys or miners. They wore clean clothes, polished boots, and matching black hats that marked them as either lawmen or professionals of a different sort. The tallest of the three, a man with a carefully trimmed mustache and cold gray eyes, surveyed the room slowly before his gaze settled on the woman in the corner. Jack recognized the type immediately. These were either bounty hunters or hired guns, men who made their living tracking people down for money. The way they moved, the confidence in their bearing, and the quality of their weapons all spoke of experience and success in their chosen profession. The woman had pressed herself back against the wall as if trying to disappear into the shadows. Her face was now deathly pale, and Jack could see her hands trembling even from across the room. Whatever these men wanted with her, she was terrified of them. The tall man with the mustache walked slowly toward her table, his boots clicking on the wooden floor in the sudden silence. His two companions flanked him but stayed near the door, effectively blocking the only exit. Every man in the saloon had stopped what he was doing to watch, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the air like smoke. When the tall man reached her table, he removed his hat politely and spoke in a voice loud enough for half the room to hear. "Miss Morrison, I presume." "Elizabeth Morrison of St. Louis, Missouri." The woman, Elizabeth, nodded slightly but said nothing. Jack noticed that she was gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "My name is Coleman Wright. I represent certain interests in Missouri who are very eager to see you return home." "You've led us quite a chase, Miss Morrison. Almost 600 miles from Kansas City to this godforsaken dust pile." Elizabeth finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I told you in my letter, Mr. Wright. I'm not going back. I can't go back." Wright's smile faded. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, miss. You see, there are certain obligations you left unfulfilled, certain debts that need to be settled. Your guardian is most insistent that you return to Missouri to address these matters." Jack didn't like the way this conversation was heading. In his experience, when men talked about obligations and debts in connection with a frightened young woman, the situation usually involved something unsavory. He caught Marcus's eye and saw that the bartender was thinking the same thing. Several other customers had begun to shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Elizabeth shook her head frantically. "You don't understand. I can't go back there. He'll kill me if I go back. Please, you have to believe me." Wright's expression hardened. "Miss Morrison, you're being dramatic. Mr. Carstairs is a respected businessman and a pillar of the community. He has no intention of harming you. He simply wants to discuss your future arrangements." The name Carstairs seemed to hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. She flinched and looked around the room desperately, as if searching for help or an escape route. Her eyes met Jack's for a moment, and he saw such genuine terror there that it made his chest tighten. Jack had never been the type of man to insert himself into other people's business, especially when those people included professional gunmen. But something about the woman's fear and Wright's cold demeanor reminded him too much of other situations he had witnessed over the years. He had seen enough frightened women and enough dangerous men to recognize when someone was in real trouble. Wright was still talking, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You'll be coming with us tonight, Miss Morrison. We have horses waiting, and we plan to make good time back to Kansas City. You can come willingly, or we can make other arrangements, but you are coming." Elizabeth stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "No. I won't go back to that monster. I'd rather die first." The entire saloon was now watching the confrontation openly. Jack noticed that several men had casually moved their hands closer to their weapons, though none had drawn yet. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Wright's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Miss Morrison, you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. We're not asking for your permission." One of Wright's companions, a stocky man with a jagged scar across his left cheek, stepped forward and spoke for the first time. "Boss, maybe we should just get this over with. The horses are getting restless, and I don't like the way these locals are looking at us." Wright nodded curtly. "Miss Morrison, you have 10 seconds to walk out of here voluntarily, or my associates will assist you." Elizabeth looked around the room one more time, her desperate gaze sweeping across the faces of the men who were watching but not acting. When her eyes met Jack's again, he saw her make a decision. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it, then opened it again. What she said next would echo in Jack's mind for the rest of his life, though at the time he didn't understand why her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Her voice was clear and carrying, meant for everyone in the room to hear. "My name is Elizabeth Morrison," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I am 19 years old, and I am the daughter of Thomas Morrison, who died of consumption in St. Louis 8 months ago. After his death, my legal guardian became a man named Josiah Carstairs, who owns several businesses in Missouri. Mr. Carstairs decided that my inheritance would be better served if I became his wife, despite the fact that he is 63 years old and already has a wife who mysteriously died last winter." The room was dead silent now. Elizabeth continued, her words coming faster as if she was afraid she wouldn't get them all out in time. "When I refused his proposal, Mr. Carstairs informed me that he had other uses for a young woman in his household. He locked me in a room in his mansion and told me I would remain there until I came to my senses. 3 weeks ago, I escaped through a second-story window and have been running ever since. These men work for Mr. Carstairs, and if they take me back to Missouri, I will not live to see my 20th birthday." Wright's face had gone red with anger. "That's enough of your lies and dramatics, you ungrateful little—" He never finished the sentence. Jack Sullivan had heard enough. He stood up slowly, his hand resting casually on the grip of his Colt, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the silent saloon. "The lady says she doesn't want to go with you. In my experience, when a lady says no, a gentleman listens." Wright turned to face Jack, his eyes narrowing as he sized up this potential threat. What he saw was a dust-covered cowboy who looked like 100 others he had encountered over the years. What he failed to see was the steady confidence in Jack's blue eyes and the way several other men in the saloon had subtly shifted their positions to support the cowboy if needed. Wright's voice dripped with contempt. "This is none of your concern, cowboy. This is a private matter involving a young woman who belongs back home with her family." Jack's voice remained calm and level. "Funny thing about that, mister. The way I heard it, the lady's family is dead, and the man who wants her back isn't related to her by blood or marriage. That makes him just another stranger trying to force a woman to do something she doesn't want to do. Around here, we call that kidnapping." The scarred man's hand moved toward his gun, but Jack was ready for it. His Colt cleared leather with practiced speed, though he didn't point it at anyone yet. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Wright raised his hand to stop his associate from drawing. "Easy, Patterson. Let's not turn this into something uglier than it needs to be." He looked back at Jack with calculating eyes. "You don't know what you're getting into here, cowboy. This woman is worth a lot of money to some very important people. People who don't take kindly to interference." Jack's gun was now pointed steadily at Wright's chest. "Maybe so. But, right now, the only people I'm concerned about are the ones standing in this room. And what I see is 3 strangers trying to force a terrified woman to go somewhere she doesn't want to go. That sits poorly with me." Around the room, Jack could see other men slowly reaching for their weapons. Hiram had produced a shotgun from behind the bar, and Marcus was gripping a wooden club. Whatever these 3 men had expected when they walked into the Silver Dollar, it clearly wasn't this level of resistance. Wright's voice took on a threatening tone. "You're making a very dangerous mistake, friend. We're not common criminals. We're authorized agents acting on behalf of Miss Morrison's legal guardian. What we're doing here is perfectly legal." Jack shrugged. maybe it's legal in Missouri. But we're in Arizona territory, and out here, a woman's word carries weight. The lady says she doesn't want to go, so she's not going." Elizabeth, who had been frozen during this exchange, suddenly found her voice again. "Please," she said, looking directly at Jack. "You don't understand what kind of men these are. They've followed me for weeks. They've already killed 2 people who tried to help me in Colorado. If you do this, they'll kill you too." Jack felt a chill run down his spine, but his aim never wavered. "What 2 people in Colorado?" Wright answered before Elizabeth could speak. "A shopkeeper and his wife in a little town called Cedar Creek. They made the mistake of hiding Miss Morrison when we came looking for her. Unfortunately, they chose to interfere in matters that didn't concern them, much like you're doing now." The casual way Wright mentioned 2 murders made Jack's blood run cold. These weren't just hired guns or bounty hunters. They were killers who had already proven they were willing to murder innocent people to complete their job. Elizabeth's face had gone white again. "They shot Mr. and Mrs. Patterson in their store when they wouldn't tell them where I was hiding. I was in their back room, and I heard everything. Mrs. Patterson was begging for her husband's life when they shot her. The room was so quiet that Jack could hear his own heartbeat. Every man present now understood exactly what kind of situation they were facing. These weren't lawmen or even ordinary criminals. They were cold-blooded murderers who would kill anyone who got in their way." Wright seemed to sense that the mood in the room had shifted even further against him. His voice took on a more reasonable tone, though his eyes remained hard and dangerous. "Look, Cowboy, you seem like a decent sort. There's no need for anyone else to get hurt here. Just walk away, and we'll forget this conversation ever happened. Miss Morrison comes with us, and everyone else lives to see tomorrow. That's a fair trade, don't you think?" Jack looked at Elizabeth, who was staring at him with a mixture of hope and terror. He thought about the 2 innocent people who had been murdered in Colorado for trying to help her. He thought about what would happen to her if she was forced to return to this Carstairs character. And he thought about what kind of man he would be if he walked away and let it happen. The decision, when it came, surprised even him with how easy it was to make. Jack's voice was steady and calm when he spoke. "Here's what's going to happen, mister. You and your friends are going to walk out of here right now, get on your horses, and ride out of town. You're going to forget you ever saw Miss Morrison, and you're going to go back to Missouri and tell whoever sent you that she died of fever somewhere in Kansas." Wright's laugh was cold and humorless. "And if we refuse?" Jack's smile was equally cold. "Then we'll find out how good you really are with those guns you're wearing. But I should warn you, there are about 20 armed men in this room, and most of them have been listening to your story about murdering shopkeepers. I don't think the odds are in your favor." For a long moment, the tension in the room was so thick it was almost suffocating. Wright looked around at the faces surrounding him, calculating his chances. What he saw was 24 grim-faced men who were clearly prepared to back up the cowboy's words with action. Finally, Wright nodded slowly. "This isn't over, Cowboy. You have no idea who you're dealing with or what you've gotten yourself into. We'll be back." Jack's gun never wavered. "Maybe you will. But you won't be taking the lady with you when you leave tonight." Wright signaled to his men, and they began backing toward the door. As they reached the entrance, Wright turned back one last time. "Enjoy your victory while you can, Miss Morrison. Mr. Carstairs is a very patient man, but his patience isn't unlimited. And you," he pointed at Jack, "you just signed your own death warrant." With that, the 3 men pushed through the swinging doors and disappeared into the night. Jack kept his gun drawn until he heard the sound of horses galloping away from town, then slowly holstered it. The silence in the saloon stretched for several more seconds before someone near the bar let out a long, shaky breath. Conversations gradually resumed, though they were quieter and more subdued than before. Jack looked at Elizabeth, who was still standing by her table, trembling slightly. He walked over to her and touched the brim of his hat politely. "Are you all right, miss?" Elizabeth nodded, though tears were starting to form in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. I don't know why you did that, but thank you. Jack studied her face for a moment, seeing past the fear to the exhaustion underneath. This woman had been running for weeks, probably sleeping outdoors and eating whatever she could find. She was at the end of her strength. Miss Morrison, do you have somewhere to stay tonight? She shook her head. I've been sleeping in the stable loft when the owner isn't watching. I don't have any money left for a hotel room. Jack made another decision that would change the course of both their lives, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. There's a boarding house on 3rd Street run by a woman named Mrs. Henderson. She's decent folk, and she won't ask too many questions. I'll pay for a room for you. Elizabeth's eyes widened. I can't accept that. You've already done too much. Jack shook his head. Miss, those men aren't going to give up just because they left town tonight. You need somewhere safe to stay while we figure out what to do next. We? Elizabeth asked. Jack realized what he had said and felt a moment of surprise at his own words. But, looking at this frightened, exhausted young woman, he knew he couldn't just abandon her to face whatever came next alone. Yes, miss. We. You helped me understand what kind of men we're dealing with, and I've seen enough of their work to know they won't stop until they get what they came for or until someone stops them permanently. As they walked toward the boarding house through the dark streets of Tombstone, neither Jack nor Elizabeth could have imagined how this single night would bind their fates together in ways that would test everything they believed about courage, sacrifice, and the price of doing what was right in a world where wrong often seemed to have all the advantages. The boarding house on 3rd Street was a 2-story adobe building with a wide front porch and windows that glowed warmly in the darkness. Mrs. Martha Henderson had run the establishment for 12 years, ever since her husband died in a mining accident up in the Chiricahua Mountains. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that could see through any lie a man might tell, but she had a soft spot for people in genuine trouble. Jack knocked softly on the front door, mindful that it was well past 9 o'clock and most decent folks would be preparing for bed. When Mrs. Henderson answered, wearing a faded blue wrapper over her nightgown, her sharp eyes took in Jack's dusty appearance and Elizabeth's pale, frightened face with quick understanding. Evening, Mrs. Henderson, Jack said, touching his hat brim. I'm sorry to bother you so late, but this young lady needs a room for the night, and I was hoping you might have something available. Mrs. Henderson stepped aside to let them into the small parlor that served as her lobby. A single oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the room smelled of lavender and beeswax. She studied Elizabeth's face carefully, noting the exhaustion and fear that the young woman was trying hard to conceal. I have one room left on the 2nd floor, she said quietly. It's small but clean, with a good lock on the door. $3 for the night, including breakfast. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out the money before Elizabeth could protest. As he handed it to Mrs. Henderson, he spoke in a low voice. The young lady has had some trouble with men who were trying to force her to leave town against her will. They may come looking for her. Mrs. Henderson's expression hardened. She had seen enough of the world to understand what that usually meant. I see. Well, anyone wanting to bother one of my guests would have to get past me first, and I keep a loaded Sharps rifle behind the front desk. She led Elizabeth upstairs to a small but comfortable room at the back of the building, overlooking the alley behind the millinery shop. The window offered a clear view of anyone approaching from that direction, and the door was solid oak with a heavy brass lock. When they came back downstairs, Mrs. Henderson fixed Jack with a steady look. Mr. Sullivan, isn't it? I've seen you around town. You seem like an honest man, but I need to know what kind of trouble you're bringing to my establishment. Jack appreciated her directness. Over the next few minutes, he gave her a condensed version of what had happened at the Silver Dollar, including Wright's casual admission about the murders in Colorado. Mrs. Henderson listened without interruption, her face growing grimmer with each detail. When he finished, she nodded slowly. I've heard about men like these Carstairs and his hired guns. They operate in the gray areas between what's legal and what's right, and they usually have enough money and connections to avoid consequences for their actions. Elizabeth, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. Mrs. Henderson, I want you to understand that I never wanted to bring trouble to anyone else. If you'd rather I left, I'll understand. The older woman's voice was firm when she replied. Young lady, any man who would send killers after a 19-year-old girl because she won't marry him is the kind of evil that decent people have to stand against. You'll stay here as long as you need to, and anyone who wants to take you away will have to answer to me and my Sharps rifle. Jack felt a surge of gratitude toward the boarding house owner. In his experience, there weren't many people willing to take a stand when it might cost them everything they had worked for. As he prepared to leave, Elizabeth caught his arm gently. Mr. Sullivan, I still don't understand why you helped me tonight. You don't know me, and now you've made enemies of some very dangerous men. Why would you risk that for a stranger? Jack was quiet for a moment, trying to find the right words. Miss Morrison, I've seen a lot of bad things happen in my life, and too many times I've stood by and done nothing because it wasn't my business. Tonight, when I looked at your face and heard what those men were planning to do to you, I realized that sometimes a man's business is whatever's happening right in front of him. He touched his hat brim again. I'll be by in the morning to check on you. We need to figure out what our next move should be. As Jack walked back through the quiet streets toward the livery stable where he kept his horse, he found himself thinking about Elizabeth Morrison and the story she had told in the saloon. The details she had provided about Josiah Carstairs and her father's death had the ring of truth, but, more than that, the genuine terror in her voice when she spoke about returning to Missouri had convinced him that whatever was waiting for her there was worse than death. The livery stable was dark except for a single lantern hanging near the entrance. Jack's buckskin gelding, Ranger, nickered softly when he heard his owner's footsteps. Jack spent a few minutes checking on the horse and making sure his gear was secure, all while thinking about the threat Wright had made before leaving town. Jack had no illusions about the danger he had placed himself in by intervening. Men like Wright and his associates didn't make idle threats, and they had already proven their willingness to kill anyone who got in their way. The smart thing would be to help Elizabeth get out of town first thing in the morning and then hope that Wright's attention would follow her rather than focusing on him. But, even as he considered this option, Jack knew he wouldn't take it. Something about Elizabeth's story had gotten under his skin in a way that he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the image of those murdered shopkeepers in Colorado, or maybe it was the thought of a young woman being forced into marriage with a man old enough to be her grandfather. Whatever the reason, Jack found himself committed to seeing this through, regardless of the personal cost. The next morning dawned clear and hot, with the promise of another scorching day ahead. Jack was up before sunrise, as was his habit, and made his way to the boarding house for breakfast. Mrs. Henderson served meals family-style in a small dining room adjacent to the parlor, and, when Jack arrived, he found Elizabeth already seated at the long wooden table, looking much better after a full night's rest. She had somehow managed to clean and press her blue dress, and her auburn hair was neatly arranged despite the lack of proper facilities. But Jack could see the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a mostly sleepless night, and the way she startled every time someone walked past the window outside. Mrs. Henderson served breakfast without comment, but Jack noticed that she kept glancing toward the windows and that her movements had the controlled tension of someone expecting trouble. The other boarders, an elderly miner named Pete and a traveling salesman called Morrison, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of worry in the room. When the meal was finished and the other guests had left for their daily activities, Jack, Elizabeth, and Mrs. Henderson sat around the table to discuss their situation. Jack had spent most of the night thinking about their options, and none of them seemed particularly promising. The way I see it, Jack began, we have three choices. First, we can try to get you out of town and help you disappear somewhere else. The problem with that is Wright and his men will probably follow, and they've already shown they're willing to kill anyone who helps you. Elizabeth nodded grimly. That's what happened in Colorado. I thought I had gotten away clean, but they tracked me down within a week. Mr. Patterson, the shopkeeper, tried to hide me in his storeroom, but somehow they knew I was there. Jack continued. The second option is to contact the territorial authorities and try to get them involved. But Wright mentioned that what they're doing is technically legal, since this Carstairs character is your legal guardian. Without proof of his criminal intentions, the law might not be able to help us. Mrs. Henderson snorted. Besides which, the nearest federal marshal is in Tucson, 3 days' ride from here. Even if we could convince him to come right in, his men could have taken Elizabeth and been halfway back to Missouri by then, but Jack had been dreading having to mention the third option, but he knew it was the only one that made sense given what they were up against. That leaves option 3. We make a stand here and force Wright to either give up or try to take you by force. Elizabeth's face went pale. Mr. Sullivan, you can't seriously be considering fighting these men. You saw what they were like last night. They're professional killers, and there are 3 of them. Jack met her eyes steadily. Miss Morrison, running away hasn't worked so far, and it's gotten innocent people killed. Sometimes the only way to deal with men like Wright is to show them that their intended victim isn't as helpless as they thought. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward. Jack's right, dear. I've seen this type before. They count on people being too scared or too decent to fight back effectively. But if you show them that taking you will cost more than they're willing to pay, they might just decide the job isn't worth it. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. When she looked up, Jack was surprised to see determination rather than fear in her eyes. If we're going to do this, she said slowly, then I want to know exactly what we're up against. There are things about Josiah Carstairs and his business interests that I haven't told you yet, things that might explain why he's so determined to get me back. Over the next hour, Elizabeth told them the full story of her life in St. Louis and the events that had led to her desperate flight west. Her father, Thomas Morrison, had been a successful merchant who dealt in rare books and manuscripts. When he died of consumption, Elizabeth inherited not only his shop and inventory but also his personal papers, which included correspondence with several wealthy collectors across the country. Among these papers, Elizabeth had discovered evidence that Carstairs had been involved in a scheme to sell forged historical documents to unsuspecting buyers. Her father had apparently stumbled across this fraud shortly before his death and had been preparing to expose Carstairs to the authorities. The letters show that Mr. Carstairs has been selling fake Civil War documents, forged letters from famous politicians, and even counterfeit land deeds to buyers in New York and Boston, Elizabeth explained. My father estimated that the scheme had generated over $50,000 in fraudulent sales. Jack let out a low whistle. $50,000 was more money than most cowboys would see in several lifetimes. It was certainly enough to motivate a man to commit murder to protect his secret. Mrs. Henderson nodded grimly. That explains why he wants you back so badly. It's not just about forcing you into marriage. He needs to get his hands on those papers before you can turn them over to the law. Elizabeth reached into her reticule and pulled out a small bundle of letters tied with string. I've been carrying the most important documents with me ever since I left St. Louis. I knew they were my only protection, the only proof I had of what kind of man Carstairs really is. Jack studied the bundle thoughtfully. Miss Morrison, these papers could be more valuable than you realize. If Carstairs is as connected as Wright implied, then exposing this fraud could bring down more than just one man. There might be other important people involved who would be very motivated to keep this information from becoming public. The implications of this revelation were sobering. They weren't just dealing with one corrupt businessman and his hired guns. They were potentially up against a network of wealthy and powerful people who had a lot to lose if Elizabeth's evidence ever reached the proper authorities. As if to emphasize the danger they were facing, the sound of horses approaching the boarding house interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Henderson moved quickly to the front window and peered carefully through the curtains. 3 riders, she announced quietly. Coming this way at a walk. They're not trying to hide their approach. Jack drew his Colt and moved to a position where he could cover the front door. Elizabeth clutched the bundle of letters tightly, her face once again pale with fear. The horses stopped directly in front of the boarding house, and Jack could hear the creak of saddle leather as the riders dismounted. A moment later, there was a firm knock at the front door. Mrs. Henderson looked at Jack, who nodded grimly. She walked to the door but didn't open it. "Who is it?" she called out. "Mrs. Henderson, my name is Coleman Wright. I believe you have a young lady named Elizabeth Morrison staying here. I need to speak with her." Mrs. Henderson's voice was steady and firm. "Mr. Wright, this is a private boarding house, and my guests' privacy is important to me. If you have business with Miss Morrison, you'll need to state it through me." There was a pause, then Wright's voice came again, this time with an edge of impatience. "Mrs. Henderson, I don't want to cause trouble for you or your establishment. But Miss Morrison is coming with us today, one way or another. It would be much better for everyone if she came willingly." Jack positioned himself beside the door, his gun ready. He caught Mrs. Henderson's eye and mouthed the word delay to her. Mrs. Henderson seemed to understand. "Mr. Wright, Miss Morrison is a paying guest in my establishment, and she's done nothing wrong that I can see. You have no authority to remove her from my property." Wright's laugh was cold and humorless. "Ma'am, I have all the authority I need. Miss Morrison is a minor who has run away from her legal guardian. I have documents signed by a Missouri judge giving me the right to take her into custody and return her to her rightful place." Elizabeth whispered urgently to Jack. "He's lying. I turned 19 3 months ago. I'm not a minor anymore." Jack nodded, then spoke loudly enough for Wright to hear through the door. "Mr. Wright, this is Jack Sullivan. We met last night at the Silver Dollar. Miss Morrison says she's 19 years old, which makes her a legal adult. Your authority over her ended on her birthday." There was another pause, longer this time. When Wright spoke again, his voice carried a clear threat. "Mr. Sullivan, I warned you last night about interfering in matters that don't concern you. Miss Morrison's age is not the issue here. She has stolen property that belongs to Mr. Carstairs, and she will be returning it along with herself." Jack felt a surge of anger at the casual way Wright was twisting the truth. "What property would that be, Mr. Wright?" "Certain documents and papers that were taken from Mr. Carstairs' office without permission." "Miss Morrison knows exactly what I'm talking about." Elizabeth's grip on the bundle of letters tightened. Jack could see the conflict in her face as she struggled with the decision of whether to give up her evidence in exchange for her safety. Mrs. Henderson spoke up again. "Mr. Wright, even if Miss Morrison did have some papers that belong to this Carstairs fellow, theft is a matter for local law enforcement, not private individuals. You'll need to involve the sheriff if you want to make accusations." Wright's patience was clearly at an end. "Mrs. Henderson, you have 30 seconds to send Miss Morrison out here, or we're coming in to get her. I'm tired of playing games with you people." Jack made a quick decision. He moved to the window and carefully peered out through the edge of the curtain. Wright and his two companions were positioned strategically around the front of the building, with clear lines of sight to the door and windows. All three men had their hands resting on their gun butts, ready to draw at the first sign of resistance. But Jack also noticed something else. Several townspeople had stopped in the street to watch the confrontation, drawn by the sound of raised voices. Among them, Jack recognized Hiram from the Silver Dollar, Marcus the bartender, and Pete the old miner from breakfast. Word was spreading that something was happening at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Jack made another quick decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. He called out loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Mr. Wright, before anyone does anything rash, I think these good people should know exactly what this is about. You're demanding that a 19-year-old woman go with you back to Missouri to marry a man old enough to be her grandfather, against her will. Is that an accurate summary?" Wright's voice was tight with anger. "That's a gross oversimplification of a complex legal matter." Jack continued in the same loud voice. "And this same man, Josiah Carstairs, has been selling forged historical documents to buyers across the country, defrauding them of thousands of dollars. Miss Morrison has evidence of this fraud, which is why Carstairs is so eager to get her back under his control." The crowd in the street had grown larger, and Jack could hear murmurs of conversation as people discussed what they were hearing. In a small town like Tombstone, word traveled fast, and having this conversation in public was putting pressure on Wright to be more careful about his methods. Wright seemed to realize this as well. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, meant only for those inside the building. "Mr. Sullivan, you're making a very serious mistake. These accusations you're making could be considered slander, and the people I represent have long memories. Mrs. Henderson stepped closer to the door. Mr. Wright, I think it's time for you and your men to leave my property. You have no legal authority here, and you're disturbing the peace. For a moment, Jack thought Wright might back down rather than risk a public confrontation. But then, he heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being drawn, followed by Wright's voice, now hard and threatening. Mrs. Henderson, open this door right now, or we're going to open it for you. Jack knew that the moment of decision had arrived. Wright was clearly prepared to use force, regardless of the witnesses or the potential consequences. There was no more time for talking or delaying. Jack positioned himself directly behind the door and called out to the crowd outside. Everyone needs to get clear of the street. These men are armed and dangerous, and they've already killed 2 people in Colorado. He heard the sound of people scrambling for cover, followed by Wright's voice, now filled with rage. That's enough. Patterson, kick in that door. Jack braced himself as heavy boots slammed into the wooden door. The frame splintered on the second kick, and the door burst open to reveal Wright's scarred companion filling the doorway, gun drawn. What happened next would be talked about in Tombstone for years to come, though the details would vary depending on who was telling the story. Jack's first shot took Patterson in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying across the porch. Wright appeared in the doorway immediately behind him, his own weapon aimed at Jack's chest. For a split second, the 2 men stared at each other over the sights of their guns, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. In that frozen moment, Jack realized that he was probably about to die, but he also realized that he had no regrets about the choices that had brought him to this point. The decision of who would fire first was taken out of their hands by Mrs. Henderson, who emerged from the kitchen carrying her Sharps rifle and announcing in a voice like thunder that the next man to set foot in her house without permission would be eating lead for breakfast. The sight of the angry woman with the heavy rifle was enough to make Wright pause, and, in that moment of hesitation, Jack heard something that changed everything. From outside came the sound of boots on wood and the distinctive click of multiple hammers being cocked. Mr. Wright, came Hiram's voice from the street, you and your boys need to drop those guns right now. You're covered from 3 directions, and we're not inclined to be patient about this. Wright looked over his shoulder and saw what Jack couldn't see from inside the house, at least 8 armed men positioned around the boarding house, all with their weapons trained on Wright and his remaining companion. The townspeople who had gathered to watch the confrontation had decided to take sides, and they had chosen to support the local boarding house owner and the cowboy who had stood up to professional killers. For a long moment, the tableau held Wright with his gun pointed at Jack, Mrs. Henderson with her rifle trained on Wright, and the sounds of the armed townspeople outside waiting for someone to make the first move. Finally, Wright slowly lowered his weapon. "This isn't over," he said, his voice filled with cold fury. "Not by a long shot." Jack kept his gun trained on Wright as the man helped his wounded companion to his feet and backed out of the damaged doorway. The sound of horses galloping away marked the end of the immediate confrontation, but Jack knew that Wright had been telling the truth. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The aftermath of the confrontation at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house brought an uneasy quiet to Tombstone. Word of the gunfight spread through town like wildfire, and, by noon, it seemed like every resident knew at least some version of the story. Jack found himself repeatedly having to explain the situation to curious townspeople, local officials, and even a reporter from the Tombstone Epitaph who wanted to write about the incident. Sheriff Johnny Bean arrived at the boarding house within an hour of Wright's departure, his face grim as he surveyed the damage to Mrs. Henderson's front door and porch. Bean was a political creature who preferred to avoid conflicts that might damage his standing with important people, but the public nature of the confrontation made it impossible for him to ignore what had happened. Jack provided a detailed account of the events, backed up by Mrs. Henderson's testimony and statements from several witnesses who had seen the confrontation. Elizabeth produced the bundle of letters she had been carrying, explaining their significance and why Carstairs was so determined to get them back. Sheriff Bean examined the documents with growing concern. While he was no expert on handwriting or document authentication, even a casual inspection revealed several suspicious inconsistencies in what were supposed to be original Civil War-era papers. The implications of a large-scale forgery operation involving wealthy collectors across multiple states were serious enough to warrant federal attention. Miss Morrison, Bean said after reviewing the evidence, these documents need to be examined by someone with more expertise than I have. I'm going to send a telegram to the U.S. Marshal's office in Tucson and request that they send someone down here to investigate this matter properly. Jack felt a measure of relief at the sheriff's words. Federal involvement would provide Elizabeth with protection that local law enforcement might not be able to guarantee, especially if Carstairs had the kind of political connections that Wright had implied. Elizabeth, however, looked worried. Sheriff Bean, how long will it take for a federal marshal to get here? Those men aren't going to wait around indefinitely, and I'm afraid of what they might do while we're waiting for help to arrive. Bean's expression was troubled. That's a valid concern, miss. It could take a week or more for a marshal to make the trip from Tucson, assuming they can spare someone immediately. In the meantime, I'll do what I can to keep you safe, but I only have 2 deputies, and they have other duties to attend to. Jack had been thinking about their security situation during the sheriff's visit, and he had reached some sobering conclusions. Wright and his men were professionals who had demonstrated their willingness to kill anyone who got in their way. They would undoubtedly be planning their next move, and it was unlikely to be as straightforward as another frontal assault on the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson seemed to be following the same line of thinking. Sheriff, these men have already shown they're not concerned about breaking the law when it suits their purposes. What's to stop them from simply waiting until dark and trying to take Elizabeth by force? Bean didn't have a good answer to that question, and Jack could see the helpless frustration in the lawman's eyes. The sheriff was an honest man trying to do his job, but he was facing a situation that was beyond the scope of normal frontier law enforcement. As the afternoon wore on, Jack found himself constantly checking the windows and listening for the sound of approaching horses. Elizabeth had retreated to her room to rest, but he could see from the way she started at every sound that she was as nervous as he was about Wright's next move. Around 4 o'clock, Jack decided to take a walk through town to get a sense of the local mood and to see if Wright and his men had been spotted anywhere in the area. What he discovered was both encouraging and troubling. The encouraging part was that word of Elizabeth's story had spread throughout Tombstone, and public opinion was strongly in her favor. The idea of a young woman being forced into marriage with an older man against her will struck a nerve with many residents, particularly the women in town. Several people stopped Jack on the street to express their support and to ask what they could do to help. The troubling part was that Wright and his companions seemed to have disappeared completely. Jack checked with the livery stable, the hotels, and the saloons, but no one had seen the 3 men since they had ridden away from the boarding house that morning. This worried Jack more than if they had been spotted drinking in a saloon or checking into a hotel. Men like Wright didn't simply give up and leave town when their first plan failed. They regrouped and came back with a better strategy. When Jack returned to the boarding house as the sun was setting, he found Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen preparing dinner with grim determination. She had borrowed a shotgun from her neighbor and positioned it within easy reach while she worked. The front door had been temporarily repaired with boards and a new lock, but it wouldn't hold up to another determined assault. Elizabeth came downstairs for dinner looking pale but resolute. She had spent the afternoon writing a detailed account of everything she knew about Carstairs' criminal activities, including names, dates, and specific details about the forged documents. If something happened to her, she wanted to make sure the evidence would survive to bring Carstairs to justice. "I've been thinking about our situation," Elizabeth said as they sat around the dinner table. "Mr. Wright is right about one thing: as long as I have those documents, Carstairs will never stop hunting me. But I've been wondering if there might be a way to use that fact to our advantage." Jack looked up from his plate. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth's voice was steady as she explained her idea. "What if we let Wright think he can get the documents back? What if we arranged a meeting where I would supposedly turn them over in exchange for my freedom?" Mrs. Henderson frowned. "That sounds extremely dangerous, dear. Men like Wright don't honor agreements once they get what they want." Elizabeth nodded. "I know it's risky, but hear me out. What if the meeting was a trap? What if we could arrange for Wright to incriminate himself in front of witnesses, maybe even get him to admit to the murders in Colorado. Jack was intrigued despite his concerns.
How would we manage something like that without putting you in extreme danger? Elizabeth had clearly given this considerable thought.
The key would be to choose the right location and make sure we had the right people positioned to witness whatever Wright revealed. If we could get him to admit to murder in front of Sheriff Bean or other officials, it wouldn't matter what legal authority he claimed to have. He'd be arrested for murder, and that would give the federal marshals time to investigate Carstairs properly. The more Jack thought about it, the more sense Elizabeth's plan made. Wright's arrogance and his anger about the morning's confrontation might make him careless enough to reveal more than he intended, especially if he thought he was finally going to complete his mission.
Mrs. Henderson was still skeptical.
It's a clever idea, but it assumes Wright will agree to a meeting and that he'll be foolish enough to incriminate himself. This man has managed to stay out of legal trouble while committing murders across multiple states. That suggests he's not careless about what he says and to whom. Jack had to agree with Mrs. Henderson's assessment, but he also knew that their current situation wasn't sustainable. They couldn't stay barricaded in the boarding house indefinitely, waiting for federal help that might or might not arrive in time. As they discussed the details of Elizabeth's proposed plan, Jack became increasingly convinced that it represented their best chance of resolving the situation without more bloodshed. The key would be to set up the meeting in a way that gave them maximum advantage while minimizing Elizabeth's exposure to danger. They decided that Jack would approach Wright the next morning and propose a trade the documents in exchange for Elizabeth's safety and Wright's departure from Arizona territory. The meeting would take place at the Tombstone Courthouse at noon, with Sheriff Bean present as a neutral observer to ensure fair play. What Wright wouldn't know was that additional witnesses would be positioned throughout the courthouse, including the newspaper reporter who had been covering the story. If Wright made any incriminating statements or attempted to use force to take Elizabeth, there would be plenty of people available to testify against him. The plan wasn't perfect, and Jack knew there were dozens of things that could go wrong. But it was better than waiting passively for Wright to make his next move on terms of his own choosing. That night, Jack barely slept. He spent most of the dark hours standing watch at the windows, listening for any sound that might indicate Wright was making another attempt to take Elizabeth by force. But the night passed quietly, and when morning came, Jack began to suspect that Wright was indeed planning something more subtle than a direct assault. Jack found Wright at the Occidental Hotel, calmly eating breakfast in the dining room as if the previous day's confrontation had never happened. The gunman looked up when Jack approached his table, his expression showing neither surprise nor concern.
"Mr. Sullivan," Wright said pleasantly. "I was wondering when you might want to continue our conversation from yesterday."
Jack sat down across from Wright, keeping his hand close to his gun.
"Miss Morrison has a proposition for you."
Wright's eyebrows rose slightly.
"I'm listening." Jack outlined the basic terms of the proposed exchange, watching Wright's face for any reaction.
The gunman listened without interruption, occasionally sipping his coffee as if they were discussing the weather rather than a matter of life and death. When Jack finished, Wright was quiet for a long moment. Then, he smiled, but there was no warmth in it.
"Mr. Sullivan, that's a very interesting proposal.
It shows that Miss Morrison is finally beginning to understand her situation realistically." Wright set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. "I'll agree to meet at the courthouse at noon, as you suggest.
But I have some conditions of my own." Jack waited for Wright to continue. "First, Miss Morrison comes alone. No armed escorts, no protective entourage. Just her and the documents."
Jack started to object, but Wright held up his hand. "Second, Sheriff Bean can be present, as you suggested, but no one else. I don't want a crowd of curious townspeople turning this into a circus." Wright's third condition was the one that made Jack's blood run cold. "Finally, Miss Morrison will accompany us out of town immediately after the exchange. I understand she's concerned about her safety, but Mr. Carstairs has authorized me to provide her with written guarantees regarding her treatment upon her return to Missouri."
Jack shook his head. "That's not acceptable.
The whole point of this exchange is that Miss Morrison gets her freedom in return for the documents."
Wright's smile became more predatory. Mr. Sullivan, I think you misunderstand the situation.
Miss Morrison is not in a position to negotiate for her freedom. She is coming back to Missouri with us, one way or another. The only question is whether she comes voluntarily or whether more people get hurt in the process. Jack felt his anger rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. Wright was showing his true colors, just as Elizabeth had predicted he might. So you're saying this proposed exchange is meaningless? That you'll take her regardless of what she gives you? Wright shrugged. The exchange serves a purpose. It allows Miss Morrison to return Mr. Carstairs' property without forcing us to search for it after we take her into custody. It also allows this matter to be resolved without further violence, which benefits everyone involved. Jack stood up slowly, his hand moving to his gun. But Wright, you just admitted that you plan to kidnap Miss Morrison regardless of any agreement we might make. That sounds like a confession to me. Wright's hand moved with practiced speed to his own weapon, but Jack was ready for it. For the second time in 2 days, the two men found themselves facing each other over drawn guns, though this time they were alone in the hotel dining room. Wright's voice was steady despite the deadly situation. Mr. Sullivan, you seem to be developing a habit of inserting yourself into situations that don't concern you. That's a dangerous habit for a man to have. Jack's voice was equally steady. The way I see it, Wright, you just confessed to planning a kidnapping. That makes it everyone's business. For several tense seconds, the two men held their positions, each waiting for the other to make a move. Then, Wright slowly lowered his weapon and holstered it. This conversation isn't over, Mr. Sullivan. Miss Morrison will be coming with us, today or tomorrow or next week. The only question is how many people get hurt while you're playing at being a hero. Wright stood up and threw some money on the table to pay for his breakfast. As he walked toward the door, he stopped and looked back at Jack. You should know that my associate Patterson's shoulder wound wasn't serious enough to put him out of action. All three of us are still available to complete our mission, and we're running out of patience with this situation. With that, Wright left the dining room, leaving Jack alone with the growing certainty that the confrontation was escalating toward a violent conclusion that none of them might survive. When Jack returned to the boarding house, he found Elizabeth and Mrs. Henderson waiting anxiously for news of his meeting with Wright. As he related the conversation, he could see the hope fading from Elizabeth's eyes. So he never intended to honor any agreement, Elizabeth said quietly. He was just trying to get me to surrender the documents before taking me anyway. Jack nodded grimly. I'm afraid so. But there is one piece of good news. Wright essentially confessed to planning a kidnapping, and he made it clear that he has no intention of respecting your legal rights. If we can get him to repeat those statements in front of Sheriff Bean, we'll have grounds to arrest him. Mrs. Henderson looked skeptical. But how do we get him to incriminate himself again? He's not likely to be as careless a second time. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, then looked up with a determined expression that reminded Jack of her plea in the Silver Dollar 2 nights before. We don't try to trick him into confessing, she said slowly. We force him to show his true nature by putting him in a situation where he has to choose between his mission and his cover story. Jack wasn't sure he liked the direction Elizabeth's thinking was taking. What do you mean? Elizabeth's voice was steady, but Jack could hear the fear underneath it. We go through with the meeting at the courthouse, but we make sure it happens in front of as many witnesses as possible. When Wright tries to take me despite any agreement we make, everyone will see exactly what kind of man he really is. Jack shook his head. Elizabeth, that's too dangerous. If Wright decides to use force, you'll be right in the middle of it. Elizabeth's eyes met his, and Jack saw in them the same desperate courage that had convinced him to help her in the first place. Mr. Sullivan, I've been running for weeks, and it's gotten innocent people killed. I can't keep running forever, and I can't keep putting other people in danger because of my problems. If we're going to end this, we have to force Wright to show everyone what he really is. As Jack looked at Elizabeth's determined face, he realized that she had come to the same conclusion he had been trying to avoid. There was no way out of this situation that didn't involve confronting Wright and his men directly. The only question was whether they could choose the time and place of that confrontation or whether Wright would choose it for them. What none of them knew was that Wright had already made his choice, and his next move would test everything they thought they knew about courage, justice, and the price of doing what was right in a world where the wrong side often held all the advantages. The Tombstone Courthouse was a modest adobe building on 3rd Street that served as the center of legal activity for the mining district. Built just 3 years earlier, it housed Sheriff Behan's office, 2 holding cells, and a courtroom that doubled as a meeting space for town council sessions and public gatherings. On most days, it was a quiet place where the routine business of frontier justice was conducted without fanfare. But, on this particular morning, word had spread through town that something significant was going to happen at noon. Despite efforts to keep the meeting private, news of the proposed exchange between Elizabeth Morrison and Coleman Wright had leaked to the general population. By 11:30, nearly 50 people had gathered in the street outside the courthouse, creating an atmosphere more suited to a public spectacle than a private negotiation. Jack stood at the window of Sheriff Behan's office, watching the growing crowd with mixed feelings. On one hand, having witnesses present would make it difficult for Wright to use violence without facing immediate consequences. On the other hand, the presence of so many people increased the risk that innocent bystanders might be hurt if the situation deteriorated. Elizabeth sat quietly in a chair beside the sheriff's desk, the bundle of documents resting in her lap. She had spent the morning making additional copies of the most incriminating letters, which were now safely hidden in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. If something happened to the originals, the evidence against Carstairs would still survive. Sheriff Behan paced nervously around his office, clearly uncomfortable with the attention the situation was generating. As an elected official, he was acutely aware that how he handled this confrontation could have significant political consequences. If he appeared weak or ineffective, it could cost him votes in the next election. But, if he acted too aggressively and someone got hurt, the consequences could be even worse. At 5 minutes before noon, Wright appeared at the end of the street, walking alone toward the courthouse with unhurried confidence. Jack noted that the gunman had left his 2 companions somewhere else, though he doubted they were far away. Wright was too experienced to face this situation without backup, even if that backup wasn't immediately visible. The crowd parted to let Wright through as he approached the courthouse steps. Jack could hear the murmur of conversation from the people outside, most of whom had only heard second-hand accounts of Wright's identity and intentions. To many of them, he probably looked like just another well-dressed traveling businessman rather than a professional killer. Wright entered the courthouse and nodded politely to Sheriff Behan. "Sheriff, I appreciate you agreeing to oversee this meeting. I'm hoping we can resolve this matter quickly and, without further complications." Behan gestured toward the courtroom. "Mr. Wright, Miss Morrison, if you'd like to proceed to the courtroom, we can get started." The courtroom was a simple space with wooden benches facing a raised platform where the judge's desk and witness chair were located. Tall windows along the east wall provided plenty of natural light, and a second door at the back of the room opened onto an alley behind the building. Elizabeth took a seat at the front of the room, while Wright positioned himself near the center aisle where he could easily reach either door. Jack noticed that Wright's coat was unbuttoned, providing quick access to his sidearm, and that his eyes continuously scanned the room as if memorizing every detail. Sheriff Behan cleared his throat. "This is an informal meeting to discuss the return of certain property and the resolution of a dispute between Mr. Wright and Miss Morrison." "Miss Morrison, would you like to begin?" Elizabeth stood up slowly, the bundle of documents in her hands. Her voice was clear and steady as she addressed Wright directly. "Mr. Wright, I have the papers that belong to my father, including his correspondence with Mr. Carstairs. I'm prepared to return them in exchange for your guarantee that Mr. Carstairs will cease all efforts to force me to return to Missouri and that you and your associates will leave Arizona Territory immediately." Wright's expression was politely attentive, as if he were listening to a reasonable business proposal. "Miss Morrison, I appreciate your willingness to return Mr. Carstairs' property. However, I'm afraid the situation is more complex than a simple exchange of documents." Wright walked closer to Elizabeth, and Jack tensed, ready to intervene if the gunman made any threatening moves. "You see," Wright continued, "the documents are only part of the issue. Mr. Carstairs is deeply concerned about your welfare and believes that you've been influenced by unscrupulous individuals who have filled your head with false accusations about his character. Elizabeth's voice remained steady, but Jack could hear the anger underneath it.
Mr. Wright, the accusations I've made are supported by evidence in my father's papers.
Mr. Carstairs has been defrauding buyers with forged historical documents, and my father discovered this before he died.
Wright shook his head sadly. Miss Morrison, I'm afraid you've been misled about the nature of those documents. Mr. Carstairs is a legitimate businessman who has never engaged in any fraudulent activities.
The papers you're referring to are either forgeries themselves or misinterpretations of legitimate business correspondence.
Jack could see what Wright was doing.
By publicly denying the allegations against Carstairs, Wright was positioning himself as a reasonable man trying to help a confused young woman rather than a hired killer pursuing a kidnapping victim. Elizabeth, however, was prepared for this tactic. She opened the bundle of papers and pulled out a specific letter, holding it up for everyone in the room to see. Mr. Wright, this letter is written in Mr. Carstairs' own handwriting and describes the sale of a forged letter supposedly written by Abraham Lincoln. The buyer paid $3,000 for a document that Mr. Carstairs admits in this correspondence is a fake. Wright's calm demeanor flickered for just a moment, and Jack caught a glimpse of the cold fury underneath. The gunman moved closer to Elizabeth, his hand drifting closer to his weapon.
Miss Morrison, I'm going to have to ask you to hand over those documents immediately. You're making very serious accusations that could damage Mr. Carstairs' reputation unfairly. Sheriff Bean stepped forward. Now hold on, Mr. Wright.
Miss Morrison has the right to present her evidence and explain her position. Wright's attention shifted to the sheriff, and Jack saw the calculation in his eyes as he weighed his options. The presence of so many witnesses was clearly complicating Wright's plans, but Jack could see that the man was far from giving up.
Sheriff Bean, with all due respect, this is a private family matter involving a young woman who has been influenced by criminals and troublemakers.
Miss Morrison needs to return to Missouri where she can receive proper guidance from her legal guardian. Elizabeth's voice rose as she responded. Mr. Wright, I am 19 years old and legally an adult. I have no legal guardian, and I will not return to Missouri to be forced into marriage with a man who has threatened to kill me. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the crowd outside pressed closer to the windows to hear what was being said. Wright's face darkened as he realized that Elizabeth was deliberately making their conversation as public as possible. Wright took another step toward Elizabeth, and Jack moved to position himself between them. The tension in the room was becoming almost unbearable, and Jack could sense that the situation was about to explode into violence. Miss Morrison, Wright said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable threat, you will stop making these ridiculous accusations immediately, and you will come with me right now.
I have had enough of your games.
Elizabeth lifted her chin defiantly.
No, Mr. Wright. I will not go anywhere with you.
And I will not stop telling people the truth about what kind of man Josiah Carstairs really is. Wright's hand moved to his gun, and Jack drew his own weapon in response. For the third time in 3 days, the two men faced each other with drawn weapons, but this time they were in front of witnesses who could see exactly what was happening. Sheriff Bean drew his own gun and pointed it at Wright. Mr. Wright, you will holster that weapon immediately. I will not have violence in my courthouse. Wright looked around the room, taking in the sheriff's drawn gun, Jack's steady aim, and the faces of the townspeople pressed against the windows outside. Jack could see him calculating whether he could shoot his way out of the situation, and, for a moment, it seemed like he might try. Then, Wright's expression changed, and Jack saw something in his eyes that chilled him to the bone. It was the look of a man who had just realized that he was trapped but who had decided to take everyone else down with him. Wright's voice was calm and deadly when he spoke.
Sheriff, you don't understand who you're dealing with here. Miss Morrison is not the innocent victim she's pretending to be.
She's a thief and a murderer who has been lying to everyone in this town. Jack felt Elizabeth stiffen beside him, and he saw the confusion in Sheriff Bean's eyes. Wright continued, his voice carrying clearly to everyone in the room and to the crowd outside. Miss Morrison murdered her father in St. Louis to gain access to his business and his money. When Mr. Carstairs discovered her crime and threatened to expose her, she stole the documents that would prove his innocence and fled west. The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations, and Jack could hear the crowd outside reacting to Wright's accusations. Elizabeth went pale but stood her ground. "That's a lie," she said firmly. "My father died of consumption, and there are medical records to prove it." Wright smiled coldly. "Medical records can be forged, Miss Morrison, as you should know better than anyone. But what can't be forged is the testimony of witnesses who saw you administering poison to your father during his final illness." Jack could see what Wright was doing. Unable to complete his mission quietly, he was now attempting to destroy Elizabeth's credibility and turn public opinion against her. If he could convince people that she was the real criminal, it would be much easier to justify taking her back to Missouri. Sheriff Bean looked confused and overwhelmed by the conflicting accusations flying around his courtroom. "Mr. Wright, these are very serious charges you're making. Do you have any evidence to support them?" Wright reached into his coat, and Jack tensed, thinking the man might be going for a hidden weapon. Instead, Wright pulled out a folded paper and handed it to the sheriff. "This is a warrant for Miss Morrison's arrest, issued by a judge in Missouri on charges of murder and theft. You'll notice it's been properly signed and sealed." Bean examined the document carefully, and Jack could see the uncertainty in the lawman's face. The warrant looked official, and if it was genuine, it would give Wright the legal authority he needed to take Elizabeth back to Missouri. Elizabeth looked at the warrant with horror. "Sheriff, that document is a forgery. There is no warrant for my arrest because I haven't committed any crimes." Wright's voice was confident now, sensing that he had gained the advantage. "Sheriff Bean, as you can see, I do have legal authority to take Miss Morrison into custody. The charges against her are serious, and she needs to be returned to Missouri to stand trial." Jack could see that Sheriff Bean was wavering. The warrant looked legitimate, and Wright's accusations were serious enough that the sheriff couldn't simply ignore them. But Jack also knew that everything Wright was saying was a lie designed to confuse the situation long enough for him to accomplish his real mission. Jack made a decision that would prove crucial to everything.